Hey folks, it's Miss J from Miss J Teaching again. I am back with a vlog post about Crenshaw, a book by Katherine Applegate. This is a New York Times bestseller that I would highly recommend having in your class as both a mentor text, as a text that acts as a window and a door for students, and as a text that can be a mirror for some of your students even who may experience homelessness, food insecurity, or financial insecurity. This is a powerful book for disrupting a single story narrative in a lot of ways, so I'm going to kind of go through this book by theme. One of the main themes that you see with almost all young adult literature is belonging. Crenshaw starts with a gripping opening that really pulls you in. This is a good mentor text to use for lead-ins, if that's something that your class and your students are working on. It also starts with a magical, open-ended piece about Crenshaw and about the name of this imaginary friend of this little boy, Jackson. One of the quotes on page 27 is, "Maybe that's why I like the name Crenshaw. It felt like a blank piece of paper before you draw on it. It was an anything is possible kind of name." So that anticipatory setup for this book that kind of leaves readers wanting more. Okay, if this is an anything is possible kind of name, what might we see in this book? The book is about a soon-to-be fifth grader named Jackson, and he lives with his family of 4. So he's got a younger sister and 2 parents. Jackson is a very analytic thinker, a very serious thinker. You see a lot of similarities to this text, The Incredible Magic of Being by Katherine Erskine. You see another very analytical thinking boy, very fact-oriented, but also has a very powerful imagination. You have this duality that kind of helps these boys navigate their world as they're trying to make sense of things and trying to mature and develop among a plethora of issues that are coming their way. He's also very perceptive, he's very observant, just like the protagonist in this book, but you also see a lot of a trauma perspective. So I've worked with students who have emotional behavior disorders, or they have a trauma background that has led to a lot of classroom behaviors that are disruptive. You see some of those attitudes and some of those characters that I've seen in my work with children with trauma exhibited by Jackson in Crenshaw, which I found interesting. That was a personal connection that I was making throughout the book. So you have this theme of belonging in this book, and belonging is a theme that we see throughout children's literature because as children grow up and start to develop a sense of identity and a sense of self, they are trying to figure out where that fits with other people's identities and other people's sense of self. But Jackson in particular doesn't feel like he belongs with his family. So he feels like he's kind of the only responsible thinker, the only one who's thinking about their future, not because his parents actually aren't, but because his parents are trying to keep things light for him. They don't actually address the real hard issues with him because they're trying to keep things light and relieve the stress, not realizing that Jackson is feeling all the stress and he feels like he's feeling all that stress alone. There's also a theme of magic and the imaginary. As I said before, Crenshaw is an imaginary friend. He's this big giant cat who likes purple jelly beans. It's kind of the connecting factor between Crenshaw and The Incredible Magic of Being is this imaginary friend characteristic of both. But as I'm considering these 2 books, I'm thinking about why do we see magic and imaginary friends over and over in children's literature? This sense of fantasy makes these really difficult issues kind of more okay in a sense. It makes it easier to navigate and handle these difficult topics if you have someone on the outside who can kind of provide an escape, provide a mentorship, provide a friendship that you're not finding in your real current narrative. The contrast is that Julian in this text believes wholeheartedly in magic, and in this text, Jackson is fighting this imaginary friend as much as possible. He doesn't want to think that he still needs an imaginary friend. He doesn't want to think that Crenshaw should be there. He's too old for it, but Crenshaw's there because he needs him, not because Crenshaw wants to be there, right? Because it's an imaginary friend. Jackson has summoned him because he needs that coping mechanism. He needs that symbol of hope in this text at that point in time as his family's facing potential housing insecurity again. And going with that theme, Jackson has this friend named Marisol who kind of brings him back into the world of imaginary. So Jackson is really fighting this world of imaginary. He's thinking about facts, he's thinking about science, he's thinking analytically, and then he has this friend Marisol that kind of brings him back and is like, no, imaginary is so valuable. This is really helpful to your existence, and adults still have imaginary friends, which is a helpful perspective to give to our students and to our children, is that imaginary friends are normal, they're typical, and they're helpful even for adults. Another theme in Crenshaw that I kind of already touched on is this theme of maturation in adulthood. And there's kind of a cognitive dissonance that exists between a child who feels really responsible for the family, who that child is not responsible for, in this childhood naivety, this childhood innocence that doesn't actually give them the world experience to navigate those difficulties and those stressors. So in that case, the understanding and perception of the child has a cognitive dissonance with their innocence and their life experience. One of the quotes from Jackson is, "Sometimes I just wanted to be treated like a grown-up. I wanted to hear the truth, even if it wasn't happy truth. I understood things. I knew way more than they thought." Which is an important thing to keep in mind. That's a common childhood perspective of, I know more than you think, I am perceptive, and we need to give our children and our students more credit than we are. But you also have this dissonance. There's a point where Jackson says, "What bothered me most, though, was that I couldn't fix anything. I couldn't control anything. It was like driving a bumper car without a steering wheel. I kept getting slammed, and I just had to sit there and hold on tight." I had to sit in that text and in those words for a minute, because as you're reading that, you really feel the visceral action. Those words are slamming you. As Jackson's feelings and his brain are getting slammed, you can feel the physical hits of the bumper cars through the words. That's an incredible moment of literary quality by Katherine Applegate. And it symbolizes his lack of control that Jackson has to change the situation, even though that's what he desperately wants to be able to do. You do see him come full circle with this theme of imaginary friends. I won't spoil the ending, but he does have a shift in perspective, and you do see some maturation, acknowledging that innocence and acknowledging that need for Crenshaw. I want him, wait, I need him here, and I'm not feeling secure in who I am and where my family's at. I'm going to start acknowledging this imaginary friend, and I'm going to start allowing him to be present in my life, which is a really cool thing to see him come full circle throughout this book with the help of others. The biggest theme, kind of the critical topic that's addressed in Crenshaw, food insecurity, homelessness, and financial insecurity. Jackson's family is facing the threat of homelessness again, and you have this really powerful flashback to first grade in which Jackson's family was homeless the first time, and he realizes that homelessness doesn't happen all at once. Financial insecurity can kind of sneak up on you, and it can be a series of unfortunate and small events that lead to homelessness, which disrupts a single story that it's a choice or that it's a laziness or that it's a sudden rash decision. The actual typical story of homelessness is a series of small events that lead to a lack of financial security. During this flashback to first grade, during this flashback to his first experience with homelessness, you see Jackson's perception of other families, other individuals who are homeless. That's disrupting the single story. You see Jackson making all of these observations that lead you to see how homelessness can vary vastly between people. So Jackson's family lived in their car. That's one type of homelessness, right? They don't have a house. They don't have secure places to park their car, whereas someone else is on a box on the ground, and that's another level of homelessness. And Jackson becomes thankful that he has a box that he can kind of hide in his car versus a box on the ground. So you see kind of the nuance of homelessness versus a single narrative or a single story. Also, as his family tries to navigate a shelter, tries to navigate food banks, you see the nuance of those and kind of the difficulty of perspective and some of the internal dialogue and the internal battles that Jackson's mother and father have to face as they're trying to figure out how to best serve their family while not compromising their own standards for themselves. Again, the final thing that disrupts a single story is Jackson's observing getting out of homelessness doesn't happen all at once either. It was a slow stage progression out of homelessness in first grade, and he's telling the reader through this flashback, becoming homeless isn't one quick and easy thing, and getting out of homelessness and into housing security isn't one thing either. It could be temporary housing to temporary housing to temporary housing before you have permanent housing. Marisol adds another level of nuance in this text in that Jackson has this financial insecurity, this food insecurity, and he's feeling all this responsibility, whereas Marisol doesn't have those things. She has a secure house. You see this contrast of insecurity and instability in families that can cause difficulty for children as they try to navigate those things can take many different forms. Another thing as I was reading this text is trying to make connections between Crenshaw and other things you could use if you're using Crenshaw as a basis for a text set or multimodal unit. One of the things that is really unique about the way Katherine Applegate wrote this book is she starts the parts of her book with quotes. So she has a dedication page with a quote, she has part 1 leading in with a quote, and then part 2 is leading in with a quote of its own. Sorry, you're seeing all my sticky notes. Those literary quotes are from A Hole to Dig, which is a children's dictionary. You could pull that in as a connection. It's a fascinating thing, and you can have students make their own connections to that, and they can do their own kind of version of that book where they make colloquial definitions or double meaning definitions of common words. So a hole is to dig. You can also make a connection to blues music. Blues music is what Jackson's father father and mother listened to. He kind of talks about how blues music can make you feel sad and happy. The content is sad, and then the sound of the music is happy. So one connection is B.B. King, who's a blues singer. And you could even have students write their own blues songs like their dad does. He kind of writes his own blues songs with his guitar. You can make connections to other symbols of hope in other texts or in life. So a symbol of hope in The Incredible Magic of Being is Julian's imaginary friend. Or connect symbols of hope to sunshine, to spring and new life. Another connection could be imaginary friends, so that easily connects between those two texts that I've already pulled up a couple of times. And you're reiterating for students that an imaginary friend is normal. It's typical to have one at age 6 or 7, even more than even 3 and 4-year-olds, because that's the point of cognitive development that our students are at. You could also have a conversation on moral absolutism based off this book. Jackson steals small things for his family. It's out of need, perceived need by Jackson. You could have a conversation about stealing. Is stealing ever ethical? Is stealing ever okay? And in that case, what makes it okay? In what situations? And who gets to decide that? That would be a very interesting and powerful conversation to have with your students. There's also a connection to bats. As Jackson kind of goes through this scientific thinking, he makes some connections to bats and to their altruism, so you could connect to books about bats. And then this whole text is based off of the Monarch School in San Diego, California. So it's a unique campus for students affected by homelessness, and it's noted in the acknowledgments of this text by Katherine Applegate. I can put the link below. Definitely check out that school, and let's think about, are we modeling other schools after this? Should we be modeling other schools after this? You could do a letter writing campaign with your students, with the students of this school, and kind of talk about homelessness or talk about similarities. They could talk about imaginary friends and kind of make connections between that. Definitely worth a look. And it continues to disrupting the single story, right? You have all these students who are homeless who are attending the school, and how do they make that happen? Why is it still important for students who are homeless to attend school, and why is it difficult for them to attend the same school that they were attending before? You could be thinking about transportation. You could be thinking about parents' fear of possibly losing their children. I do want to bring up 2 other books that I read this week. We've got Curious About Fossils by Kate Waters and What Makes a Monster by Jess Keating. This is the same author who does Pink is for Blobfish, which kids love. The whole concept for this book is that we fear things that we don't understand. Some of these monsters, they're actually fearful, something we should be afraid of, but for most of them, they're not actually anything that's going to harm a human or harm a child. A big lesson we want to be teaching our students is learn to understand the things before you fear them. The connection to Crenshaw could be that we sometimes fear people who are homeless or fear people on the street, or we perpetuate a fear about people who are experiencing homelessness that we might see on the street. But if we don't understand their situation, we don't know why they're there, and we know it's likely a small series of things that led to them being in that position, and that it's a difficult position to navigate and a difficult position to get out of and to find housing security. You can also connect to, they talk about the vampire bat in this text, and again, that connects back to Jackson's affinity for bats and Crenshaw. This text also ends with saying hello to the human within a book of monsters, which is a powerful ending to this book because I think most students don't anticipate that. But thinking about, we are some of the most powerful creatures on this planet because we have certain weapons and we have a certain level of intelligence and civilization and communication that give us a huge advantage over animals. And how are we using that? Are we using that to be monster-like? Or are we using that to help others and to help animals in our world? And how do we decide those things? So that's, again, a very powerful, interesting conversation we could have with our students about their impact on the world and potential call to action afterwards. The other book to connect to is Curious About Fossils. This is another scientific text, like What Makes a Monster, but it's put out by the Smithsonian Institute. The thing I do like about this book is it kind of has a story that humanizes this nonfiction. So this is a very scientific text. It's kind of dense. It's got a lot of information, a lot of pictures, a lot of nonfiction text in here, classic text features of nonfiction text. But it tells a story about Mary Anning finding fossils along the seashore that she could sell. And she was the first person to find many new prehistoric animals because she was looking for these fossils and she thought they were really curious. Having a female scientist being in this text and kind of adding this narrative to this nonfiction lifts it up and makes it more intriguing to students, more appealing to students who might not otherwise be interested in this book. So as we're talking about student motivation, student interest, the connection to self might pull students in and connection to this narrative. Again, student interest, we want to lead students down paths of inquiry into texts that they're interested in. So if you have a student interested in fossils, interested in dinosaurs, interested in paleontology, interested in lab work dealing with paleontology, this text addresses all of that. I would say there's almost always one student who's interested in fossils. It's a window into the past. So as we talk about windows into different experiences, this is a window into the past through fossils, and I think almost every child is attracted to fossils to some extent. Maybe not to books that are this text heavy, But this is a book that's worth having in your classroom because this leads children into inquiry. I recommend all 3 of these books, using these texts for critical conversations, discussing critical issues, and pushing our students to become more critical 21st century thinkers. Keep on pushing your own thinking and keep on pushing the thinking of your students. Signing off, it's Miss J.